The oldest boat human beings ever made is almost certainly not in a museum. It almost certainly vanished long before anyone thought to preserve it. Perhaps it was a fallen trunk pushed into a quiet inlet, a bundle of reeds tied with twisted grass, or a skin held open by a few light sticks. Whatever its form, it belonged to people who already understood water as part of their landscape. They knew where a current slackened behind a point, how wind roughened one shore while leaving another calm, and which floating material would carry a person without rolling beneath them. Archaeology can show us only a late and uneven selection from that much longer experience. Wood decays, cordage dissolves, hides disappear, and shorelines move. Sea level rose by more than 100 meters after the last ice age, drowning many places where early coastal communities once lived. A surviving hull is therefore evidence of one craft at one moment, not a certificate announcing the first time human beings went afloat. The safest beginning is not a date but a practical problem. A person on one bank wanted to reach another. Fish, shellfish, waterbirds, islands, relatives, trading partners, or safety lay beyond the dry ground. The solution required buoyancy, balance, propulsion, and enough confidence to leave the bottom behind. From those needs came an extraordinary variety of boats. Their history is not a single line of progress from crude rafts to perfect ships. It is a branching record of materials, waters, skills, and choices. Before following that record, it helps to know what a boat builder actually controls. Water pushes upward against the submerged part of a vessel. If the weight of the craft and everything aboard is less than the weight of the water displaced, the vessel floats. Yet floating is only the beginning. A narrow round log may support a person and still be unpleasantly unstable. A broad raft resists rolling, but can be difficult to steer. A deep hull carries more, though it may ground in shallows. Length can improve speed, but a long structure must resist bending as waves lift its middle and ends unevenly. Every builder works within such tensions, whether using stone tools beside a forest lake or computer-guided cutters in a modern yard. Materials impose another set of conditions. A reed stem is light and buoyant, but loses strength as it becomes waterlogged. Bark forms a ready-made sheet, though it tears if a frame presses too sharply against it. Hide makes an efficient covering when kept supple and well sewn. A tree trunk gives a strong continuous shell, but its size limits the boat and its removal demands labor. Planks free the builder from the dimensions of one tree, while creating hundreds or thousands of seams that must remain tight as wood swells, shrinks, twists, and works at sea. The history ahead is best understood as a succession of answers, each suited to particular circumstances and none inevitable. People reached Australia at least 50,000 years ago, when lower sea levels narrowed some channels, but did not eliminate every water crossing between Southeast Asia and the ancient continent of Sahul. The movement implies deliberate crossings by groups capable of founding communities, although no vessel from those voyages survives and its design is unknown. Much later, human settlement of islands in the Mediterranean, Japan, and other regions likewise, tells us that watercraft existed where direct physical remains are absent. Such evidence establishes capability, not appearance. A voyage could have used rafts, dugouts, skincraft, or forms for which there is no modern equivalent. Even experimental replicas must be interpreted modestly. When a reconstructed reed boat completes a crossing, it proves that the chosen materials and design can make that journey under the tested conditions. It does not prove that ancient voyagers used precisely that boat, followed that route, or sailed for the same reason. Possibility matters, but it is not identity. Careful boat history therefore places three kinds of knowledge beside one another: excavated remains that show what survived, images and texts that show what people chose to record, and living craft traditions that preserve skilled practices while continuing to change. Each source illuminates the others without becoming a substitute for them. The earliest, widely accepted surviving watercraft is the canoe found near Pesse in the Netherlands. Workers encountered the piece of Scots pine and peat during road construction in 1955. Radiocarbon dating places it broadly between about 8,250 and 7,550 and 7,550 before the Common Era. It is just under 3 meters long and roughly 44 centimeters wide. Its shallow hollow was made in a single trunk, leaving a narrow little craft at once prompted doubts about whether it truly functioned as a boat. A modern reconstruction floated and could be paddled, but even without that experiment, the shaping marks and context support its interpretation as a dugout canoe. Pesse is the oldest hull yet recovered, not necessarily the ancestor of later canoes. Its preservation depended upon wet, oxygen-poor ground that slowed decay. Countless earlier vessels may have returned completely to soil or been lost beneath the rising sea. Still, this small object reveals something profound. Mesolithic makers did not merely climb onto logs. They selected a trunk, opened its interior, controlled wall thickness, and produced a vessel with an intentional inside and outside. They transformed the natural buoyancy of wood into a shaped container for a human body and equipment. Making a dugout with stone tools is slow, but it is not mysterious. The builder first judges a tree for length, diameter, straightness, rot, branch scars, and grain. Felling can be accomplished by repeated chopping with a polished or flaked stone axe, sometimes aided by fire used cautiously around the base. Once the trunk lies on supports, unwanted wood is removed from the top. Controlled burning can char a shallow layer that is easier to scrape, but uncontrolled heat may split the log or thin one side more than the other. Adzes, whose cutting edges are set across rather than in line with the handle, are especially useful for hollowing. Marks left on archaeological canoes sometimes reveal the width and direction of tool strokes. Builders can monitor thickness by tapping, by comparing inside and outside surfaces, by using small drilled reference holes that are later plugged, or through embodied judgment learned from previous hulls. The ends may be sharpened to part water. The bottom may remain rounded, flattened, or given a shallow V according to local practice. A craft intended for marsh channels differs from one expected to cross open water. No written plan is required. Shape can be remembered through proportions, hand spans, chords, templates, and the builder's eye. Dugouts appear independently across much of the world because large trees offer both material and preliminary form. Finds from European lakes and river valleys show many variations through the Neolithic and later periods. Some have simple trough-like interiors, others carry carefully shaped ends, steps for seats, repair holes, or evidence that sides were raised. A broad trunk can produce a cargo boat, while a slender one becomes a hunting canoe. In tropical forests, enormous trees permitted hulls far larger than the Pesse craft. Yet the phrase dugout canoe can hide as much as it reveals. One community may burn and scrape, another works almost entirely with adzes. One builder leaves the outside close to the trunk's curve. Another carves a thin, elegant shell. Some hulls are paddled alone. Others joined to outriggers, expanded with heat, or extended upriggers, expanded with heat, or extended upward by planks. The most distinctive stage in the expanded dugout tradition of Estonia's Sonia-Soma region, for example, heat and moisture soften the completed shell so its sides can be forced apart, increasing capacity and changing the bottom's form. The method survives as living knowledge, transmitted through demonstration. It reminds us that a single piece of wood need not dictate its final breadth. Expansion demands a delicate understanding of timber. Green wood contains moisture and can be persuaded into shapes that dry wood would resist. Builders thin the shell unevenly according to how each part must move, fill it with hot water or heat it over a controlled fire, and gradually spread the sides with braces. Too much force causes a fatal split along the grain. Too little leaves the intended volume unrealized. The operation may take place in stages, allowing fibers to relax before the next brace is inserted. Once widened, crosspieces hold the new beam while the hull cools and dries. Similar principles appear in several regions, even where exact procedures differ. The resulting craft shows why categories such as dugout and plank build should not be treated as sealed boxes. A hollowed trunk can become the foundation of an assembled vessel. Wash strakes, meaning extra boards along the upper sides, add freeboard. End pieces lengthen, or lift the bow. Frames and thwarts stabilize the expanded shell. Outrigger booms transform its balance. What begins as one trunk may finish as a composite machine whose strength depends on carved wood, fitted planks, fiber lashings, and carefully distributed flexibility. Where suitable trees were scarce or another material answered the water better, reeds contain air and float individually. Bound together, they create a platform or a boat-shaped mass whose many stems share the load. The simplest raft lies flat, but thicker bundles can be tapered, curved upward, and lashed into a hull with a distinct bow and stern. Ancient Egyptian images show papyrus craft, and actual papyrus boats were used on the Nile alongside wooden vessels. In Mesopotamian marshes, reed boats and basket-like coracles served rivers and wetlands. On Lake Titicaca in the Andes, Aymara and Uros makers have built craft from totora reeds, arranging fresh material around denser cores and renewing vessels as the organic structure ages. These traditions are related by material logic, not evidence of one unbroken worldwide invention. Similar plants invite similar solutions. A reed hull does not remain permanently dry. Its performance changes as stems absorb water and compress. Maintenance, drying, and replacement belong to its design. Judging such a vessel by the lifespan of an oak ship would misunderstand what its builders optimized: local abundance, lightness, reparability, and the ability to work without a sawmill or great forest. Rather than excavating the trunk, a maker removes a sheet of outer covering during the season when it separates most readily. The bark is softened, folded or gathered at the ends, and held open by a light internal framework. Gunwales stiffen the upper edges. Ribs spring between them, and longitudinal strips protect the skin from concentrated loads. Seams are stitched with roots or fiber and sealed with resinous compounds. In the woodlands of North America, birch bark supported canoes that combined low weight with impressive carrying capacity. Their exact forms varied among indigenous nations and according to lakes, rapids, cargo, and portage routes. The familiar fur trade canoe was not simply a European boat copied in bark. It emerged through indigenous technologies, regional specialization, and colonial demand, often built and paddled by people whose knowledge made long-distance commerce possible. In Australia, bark canoes were likewise diverse. Sheets might be tied at the ends, shaped with fire, or supported in ways fitted to rivers, estuaries, and coastal use. A surviving museum object records only one moment in this living field of practice. Bark construction turns apparent fragility into an advantage. A damaged area can be patched, a light hull can be carried between waters, and the forest supplies much of what repair requires. Animal skin stretched over a frame solves the same structural problem by separating waterproof surface from supporting skeleton. The outer covering keeps water out and transmits pressure, The framework holds shape and carries concentrated forces from people, cargo, and propulsion. In the Arctic, kayak and umiak traditions developed with extraordinary precision among Inuit, Yupik, and related peoples. But neither word names one universal design. Kayaks were tailored to region, activity, and sometimes individual paddler. Driftwood and other available timber could be supplemented by bone. Joints were lashed rather than rigidly nailed, allowing the structure to work in waves. Prepared seal skins were sewn with waterproof stitches and tensioned over the frame. The decked kayak reduced the opening through which cold water might enter, while the larger open umiak carried families, hunters, dogs, and possessions. Women played central roles in preparing and sewing skins, and the soundness of those seams could be a matter of survival. In Ireland and Wales, hide-covered curraghs and coracles used different frames for coastal travel, fishing, and river work. Some modern descendants use fabric or synthetic coverings, demonstrating continuity through adaptation rather than frozen survival from antiquity. Skin and bark boats make an important engineering point. A hull need not be thick to be strong enough. Strength can arise from the relationship between a tensile covering and a frame that distributes load. Lashings may outperform rigid fasteners when a light craft must flex. The same principle appears in many later vessels, though with different materials. It also warns against arranging boat types on a ladder from primitive to advanced. A kayak built for cold, broken water solves problems that a heavy planked boat might handle badly. A coracle can be carried by one person and launched from a muddy bank where a keel would snag. A reed cabalito used in coastal Peru can be straddled through surf. Fitness depends on purpose. Boat building history becomes clearer when each craft is asked the question its makers faced. What must this vessel do here, with these resources, for these people? The move from a single trunk to several planks opened possibilities of scale and shape, but it also created a difficult new task. Separate pieces had to behave as one watertight shell. Before cheap iron nails, builders joined planks with fiber cords, wooden fasteners, shaped edges, internal lugs, mortises, and combinations of these devices. A sewn boat is not a fabric object. Its wooden planks are pierced and tied to one another, often over padding that protects the cord and closes the seam. Holes may pass directly through plank edges or emerge on interior faces, so the exterior remains smoother. Stitches can run continuously, cross in patterns, or form separate ligatures. Caulking material lies between edges or beneath battens. Resin, oil, hair, moss, grass, and plant fibers have all served as seam treatments in different traditions. When wet, some fibers swell and tighten. The result may be intentionally flexible. In surf, a hull that yields slightly can absorb impacts that would loosen rigidly. The 19th century masula boats of southern India used to move people and cargo between ships and beaches before modern harbors joined planks with core rope and cushioned seams with vegetable material. Their flexibility was not an unfinished stage on the way to nails. It was part of how they survived breaking water. One remarkable sewn vessel was found in shallow water at Zambratija Bay on the Istrian coast of Croatia. Dated from the late 12th to the late 10th century, before the Common Era. It is the oldest known Mediterranean example of its kind. The preserved bottom combines elements hollowed from single pieces with attached planking, a construction family sometimes described as an assembled dugout. Cordage once passed through carefully arranged holes, drawing components together. The wreck matters not because it reveals the origin of sewing, which is far older and may have arisen many times, but because it captures a regional solution at the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Its recovery in 2023 allowed detailed recording and conservation, yet raising waterlogged timber creates a second history. Once removed from its stable wet setting, wood can shrink, crack, and collapse, unless water in its weakened cells is replaced or removed under controlled conditions. The archaeological boat becomes a long-term scientific project as well as an ancient artifact. Across island Southeast Asia and into the Pacific, another important family of construction used projecting lugs carved on the inner surfaces of planks. Lashings connected those lugs to frames or to one another without necessarily piercing the outer hull. The term lashed-lug describes a principle, not a single standardized boat. Planks could be edge-joined with dowels, then reinforced by internal ties. Variations shifted over time and from island to island. This method helps explain how builders assembled light yet capable hulls from multiple pieces while retaining controlled flexibility. It also formed part of a much larger technological system that included outriggers, double hulls, sophisticated sails, and navigational knowledge. Archaeology rarely preserves the complete system. A plank with a lug may survive while its fiber tie, mast, sail, and oral geometry vanish. Reconstructing the vessel requires comparison. The comparison must not flatten regional differences. A modern canoe is not a direct photograph of a prehistoric one. It carries centuries of innovation, exchange, loss, revival, and local meaning. An outrigger changes a narrow canoe by placing buoyancy at a distance from the main hull. One or more booms reach sideways to a float. As the canoe begins to roll toward that side, the float resists submersion. When the hull rolls away, its weight and the geometry of the connection also matter. The arrangement allows a slender main hull with less wave-making resistance than a broad boat of similar capacity. Some traditions use one outrigger, others two, and double canoes join hulls of comparable size. These choices interact with sailing technique. Certain Pacific single outrigger vessels are shunted, rather than turning the bow through the wind. The crew reverses direction, so the former stern becomes the bow, keeping the outrigger on the preferred side. Asymmetrical hulls can be shaped to balance the side force of the sail. None of this is improvised simplicity. It is a coherent response to ocean travel, reef passages, beach launching, available timber, and the need to repair a vessel far from industrial supply. The settlement of remote Oceania was one of history's greatest achievements in boat building and navigation. Austronesian-speaking communities moved eastward through island Southeast Asia and into the Pacific over many centuries. Lapita-associated peoples reached areas of Melanesia and western Polynesia by the second millennium before the Common Era, and later voyagers settled the vast Polynesian Triangle, extending to Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. Boats from the founding voyagers have not survived intact, so their precise rigs and hull configurations remain debated. Linguistic reconstruction, archaeological distribution, early European observations, indigenous histories, and living practice each contribute partial evidence. It is reasonable to say that capable sailing canoes, transported plants and animals, social organization, and practiced wayfinding made settlement possible. It is not reasonable to reduce the achievement to accidental drift. Voyagers read stars, swells, winds, clouds, birds, and the changing character of the sea. They also built vessels able to carry people, water, food, tools, and the biological foundations of new communities. Carolinian canoe-making in Micronesia shows how construction, mathematics, navigation, and community remain intertwined. Builders select and fell a suitable tree, shape components mainly with adzes, use indigenous systems of proportion, fit an asymmetrical hull, lash an outrigger, and seal seams with locally prepared materials such as breadfruit sap. Master carvers and navigators teach through apprenticeship. UNESCO placed Carolinian wayfinding and canoe-making on its urgent safeguarding list in 2021. because few specialists remain and transmission is threatened by migration, environmental change, and replacement technologies. That status should not turn practitioners into exhibits. Their canoes belong to contemporary communities making present choices. The living craft can help researchers recognize what tool marks or lashings do, but its foremost value is to the people who own and renew the knowledge. Respectful history listens to named traditions, rather than treating all oceanic canoes as interchangeable survivors of a distant past. Long before the first Egyptian planked ship known to archaeology, Nile communities used the river as road, field edge, food source, and sacred landscape. Predynastic pottery and rock art include boat images, though interpreting every painted shape as a technical drawing would be risky. Actual timbers provide firmer details. At Abydos, archaeologists found a group of long, narrow boats buried beside an early royal funerary enclosure and dating to around 3000 before the Common Era. Their hulls were made from thick wooden planks joined with mortise-and-tenon fittings and lashings, with reed bundles used in seams. They were buried as complete vessels rather than dismantled kits. The boats demonstrate organized access to timber and skilled labor at the beginning of the Egyptian state. They also show that elaborate planked construction did not suddenly appear with the pyramids. River transport, royal ritual, and administration had already supported generations of builders. Egypt lacked endless supplies of long, straight ship timber. Native acacia, sycamore fig, and tamarisk could be used, while cedar from the Levant arrived through exchange. Scarcity shaped technique. Builders could assemble short or irregular pieces into a strong shell, fitting plank edges with care and using transverse lashings through internal channels. Egyptian hulls often lacked the deep continuous keel familiar from later Mediterranean ships. A heavy rope running fore and aft above the deck could act as a truss, helping the long hull resist sagging. Planks were shaped to interlock through joggled edges and were aligned with loose tenons. Frames did not necessarily determine the hull at the beginning. Instead, the shell took form through the relationship of planks, seams, crossbeams, and rope. Calling this shell first is useful if it describes sequence, but it should not imply that every Egyptian vessel followed one recipe. Boat models, reliefs, reused timbers, and surviving hulls reveal variation by period and purpose. The most famous Egyptian vessel is the large cedar ship associated with King Khufu and buried beside the Great Pyramid in the 26th century before the Common Era. Discovered in 1954, it had been carefully dismantled into more than 1,000 components and stacked in a sealed pit. Restoration took years because the pieces did not arrive with an instruction book. The assembled hull is about 43 meters long. Its planks are connected by mortise-and-tenon joints and extensive rope lashing, while large timbers are shaped with remarkable precision. Evidence suggests the construction permitted dismantling, an advantage if a vessel needed to be transported around cataracts or across land, although the ship's exact history and ritual purpose remain debated. It may have carried the king's body, participated in ceremonies, or represented a solar journey. Physical wear has been interpreted in different ways. What can be stated with confidence is that its builders mastered full-scale construction without iron spikes, relying on fitted wood and cordage to create a long, resilient shell. Imagine the sequence without assuming a modern plan laid flat on paper. Timber procurement began far from the building ground. Trees had to be selected, felled, trimmed, transported, and seasoned or worked green according to purpose. A master builder controlled proportions through cords, rules, templates, and remembered geometry. Bosom planks were arranged and edge-fitted. Mortises cut across the grain accepted small tenons that helped to line neighboring pieces, while lashings passed through channels and tied the structure internally. The ends rose through shaped planking rather than a massive straight keel. Crossbeams spread the sides and supported a deck. A longitudinal hogging truss was tensioned above. Steering oars, Cabins, deck fittings, and rigging followed. Each operation depended upon teams, woodworkers, rope makers, haulers, supervisors, and suppliers. The completed ship condensed an economic landscape that stretched from cedar forests to the Nile and a political system capable of directing specialized labor. Boat building at this scale was never only carpentry. Egyptian shipwrights also built working craft, whose lives were less ceremonial. Boats carried grain, cattle, stone, soldiers, officials, and ordinary passengers. Barges transported enormous blocks by combining buoyancy with coordinated towing and favorable water levels. The sail exploited prevailing northerly winds for travel upstream, while the river's current assisted the return north. Not every trip followed this neat pattern, but the pairing gave the Nile unusual transportation logic. Hulls grounded on banks, encountered shifting channels, and required repair. Planks from dismantled vessels could be reused in buildings or other boats, complicating archaeological interpretation. A timber found far from water may retain mortises that reveal an earlier life. Models placed in tombs show crews and equipment, yet they present idealized activity at a reduced scale. A model mast or steering arrangement is evidence, not a complete naval manual. The working river fleet remains less visible than royal burials, even though it sustained the society that created them. During the later Bronze Age, maritime networks connected Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, Anatolia, the Aegean, and regions beyond. The ship that sank near Uluburun on the southern coast of modern Turkey in the late 14th century, before the Common Era, carried copper ingots, tin, glass, pottery, luxury goods, and personal objects from a remarkably wide world. Only part of its hull survived, but those timbers reveal thick planks joined edge to edge by pegged mortise-and-tenon joints. A rectangular tenon bridged matching slots in adjacent planks, and a wooden peg driven through plank and tenon locked the connection. Repeated at close intervals, the joints made the shell structurally coherent before substantial internal framing was added. This did not mean the frames were unimportant. It means the planking itself carried a large share of the early construction logic. The wreck gives a secure example of a technique, while its cargo illuminates exchange. It does not tell us the ethnicity of every crew member or permit a simple national label for the ship. Late Bronze Age seafaring crossed political and cultural boundaries that modern maps can exaggerate. Mortise-and-tenon construction demanded immense labor. Each joint required paired slots aligned across an edge, a tenon shape to fit, and pegs driven without splitting the plank. On a large hull, the number could reach into the thousands. Planks were not thin boards bent casually around ready-made ribs. They were substantial pieces carved to their place, sometimes edge-locked so strongly that the shell could hold form as work proceeded. Builders likely used molding aids and control marks, but their exact design methods are reconstructed from tool marks, symmetry, later texts, and experimental practice. The technique appears in varying forms around the ancient Mediterranean and continued for many centuries. Its spread may reflect movement of specialists, imitation, shared ancestry, or several mechanisms at once. A construction feature can travel without an entire ship type traveling with it. Local builders absorb an imported joint into their own proportions, timber supply, rig, and working habits. The sea did not erase older solutions when mortise-and-tenon hulls appeared. Sewn boats continued around the Mediterranean, including the Zambratija craft, later Greek examples, and regional vessels of the Western Basin. Reed craft remained on rivers and coasts. Dugouts served beside plank ships. This overlap is central. Histories organized around invention dates can create the illusion that one method replaced another everywhere. Actual boatyards were conservative and experimental at the same time. A familiar joint had value because builders knew how it behaved after years of loading. Changing it transferred risk to the owner, crew, and cargo. Innovation often entered through repair, hybrid construction, a shortage of timber, or a new demand such as carrying heavier amphoras. The useful question is not when an old method ended, but why a community retained, modified, or abandoned it. Greek and Phoenician maritime expansion during the first millennium before the Common Era rested on ships that were specialized without becoming uniform. Long, low galleys emphasized oars, speed, and crews trained to move together. Rounder merchantmen devoted more of their volume to cargo and depended primarily on sail. Both could use edge-joined planking, internal frames, and substantial keels, yet their proportions and scantlings reflected different work. A galley needed enough longitudinal strength to keep a narrow hull from bending, while many oarsmen and their benches imposed repeated loads. A trader had to carry amphoras, grain, metals, timber, or passengers without losing stability or consuming its payload in excessive hull weight. Warships were often pulled ashore, or housed in sheds, reducing some forms of marine growth, but demanding lightness and organized handling. Merchant ships remained afloat longer and required protection, pumping, caulking, and repair in ports. Written descriptions celebrate fleets and battles, while wrecks more often preserve cargo carriers. The imbalance can distort our picture, unless we remember that everyday shipping supported the naval powers that dominate the texts. The Kyrenia ship, which sank near Cyprus around the end of the 4th century before the Common Era, preserves a merchant hull after a long working life. Its Aleppo pine planks were joined with pegged mortise-and-tenon fastenings, and internal frames were secured with copper nails. Lead sheathing protected parts of the exterior. Decisions about missing upper works, sail area, ballast, and rigging must be declared because they affect results. Its voyagers can test whether the reconstruction behaves plausibly. They cannot make every uncertain feature ancient by association. Roman shipbuilding inherited Mediterranean shell-based practices and adapted them across a vast commercial system. Wrecks reveal wine carriers, grain ships, harbor craft, barges, fishing boats, and naval vessels rather than one Roman type. Plank edges were often connected by closely spaced mortise and tenon joints. Frames came inside the completed or partly completed shell and were fastened with tree nails, or both. Rivière of water to reach palm. Lead sheets sometimes guarded vulnerable exterior surfaces, while sacrificial planking or coatings answered marine organisms. Builders used oak, pine, fir, elm, and other species according to availability and function. A keel asks for different properties than a bent frame or broad plank. Ancient timber study can identify species and growth patterns, but origin is not always certain. A log may have traveled, a ship may have been repaired in a distant harbor, and recycled wood may carry marks from an earlier use. Roman vessels also expose the difficulty of converting tonnage words into physical reality. Ancient authors might describe capacity through cargo units, while archaeologists estimate displacement from incomplete hull lines. Amphoras occupy space irregularly, grain shifts unless contained, and water carried for people adds weight without profit. The structure must support not only downward loads in calm water, but changing pressure in waves. Floors cross the bottom. Footocks continue frames upward. Beams tie the sides, and knees brace angles where grain direction matters. Fastenings concentrate stress if poorly placed. Caulking must remain compressed as planks move. A ship is therefore less like a rigid box than a managed field of forces. Ancient builders could control those forces without modern engineering equations because generations of successful and failed vessels had established trustworthy proportions. Rule of thumb is not absence of knowledge. It is compressed experience, though it may be vulnerable when a patron demands a shape beyond the familiar range. Between late antiquity and the early medieval period, Mediterranean builders gradually changed how whole form was controlled. This transition is often summarized as a move from shell-first to frame-first construction, but the evidence shows intermediate practices rather than a clean switch. In a strongly shell-based sequence, edge-joined planks establish much of the shape before frames reinforce them. In a strongly skeleton-based sequence, the keel and a designed set of frames define transverse form before most planking is applied. Between those poles, builders erected some predetermined frames, used rib bands to guide shape, or let initial planks and frames develop together. Wrecks at sites such as Yassiada, Sese Limonare, and the Yenikapare harbor in Istanbul provide snapshots across centuries. Fastener density changed. Edge joints became less structurally dominant, and framing assumed a larger role. The reasons likely included labor, timber economy, scale, and evolving design methods rather than a sudden discovery that frames existed. The 7th to 8th century merchant ship known as Magan Mikhail B, found off the coast of Israel, illustrates a mature but still historically situated construction system. Its surviving 24-meter hull includes keel, endposts, framing timbers, planks, stringers, bulkheads, and a mast step assembly. Rigging pieces and possible sail fragments support a latent rigged reconstruction. Detailed carpentry records the sequence by which components were fitted. Yet even a well-preserved wreck cannot answer every operational question. The ship lies deformed by burial and loss of upper works. Timber may have been replaced during use. The builder's intended curves must be separated from post-wreck distortion. Digital models can test fair hull lines, but their smoothness should not conceal uncertainty. The most honest reconstruction includes confidence levels, measured here, inferred there, and unknown elsewhere. While Mediterranean shipwrights adjusted edge joints and framing, builders around the Indian Ocean worked within other enduring systems. The region linked East Africa, Arabia, the Persian Gulf, India, Sri Lanka, Ireland, Southeast Asia, and China through monsoon winds. Seasonal reversals encouraged long voyages timed around predictable patterns, but boats still had to cope with cyclones, reefs, surf landings, worm damage, and ports with different facilities. The convenient word dhow covers several hull and rig traditions, and should not be mistaken for an ancient, unchanging design. Sewn plank construction was once widespread around the western Indian Ocean. Coconut core made excellent cordage when processed and twisted. Planks could be stitched over caulking, with interior ribs added after the shell took shape. Later vessels increasingly used iron nails in many yards, while sewing continued where its cost, flexibility, or inherited practice remained valuable. Neither technique belongs to one religion or language. The early 9th century wreck found near Belitung Island in Indonesia carried a large cargo of Chinese ceramics and other goods westward. Its hull was sewn with fiber cord in a tradition associated with the Western Indian Ocean, offering physical evidence that such ships crossed far beyond the Arabian Sea. A modern reconstruction called the Jewel of Muscat was built to explore the materials and methods that could have produced the wreck. Craftspeople used planks, coir stitching, and a historically informed rig, then sailed the vessel from Oman towards Singapore. The project demonstrated the demanding labor hidden in a sewn hull, drilling paired holes, drawing kilometers of cordage tight, protecting stitches, sealing seams, and inspecting them throughout the voyage. It also illustrated proper experimental caution. The reconstructed ship embodied a set of scholarly choices. Its successful passage showed capability without identifying the original crew or proving a single regular route. Along the Persian Gulf, wooden lenge vessels carried dates, timber, pottery, coconuts, fruit, and other goods, and supported fishing and pearl diving. Their 20th century construction often used imported hardwoods, iron fastenings, frames erected from the keel, caulked seams, and protective coatings. Navigation, weather vocabulary, work songs, ownership, and shipyard ritual formed part of the same maritime culture. UNESCO placed Iranian lenge building and sailing skills on its urgent safeguarding list in 2011, as wooden craft gave way to cheaper fiberglass boats and experienced builders aged. The shift is not simply a contest between authentic wood and false plastic. Fiberglass reduces some maintenance and may fit present economics. The cultural loss arises when vocabulary, measured proportions, forest knowledge, coordinated labor, and navigational practice no longer find context for transmission. A boat-building tradition lives only when people can make a livelihood and when younger practitioners have reason to learn. South Asian coasts demanded vessels able to negotiate heavy surf where sheltered harbors were absent. The Mashila boat of India's Coromandel coast used planks sewn with coir in a pattern that permitted the hull to flex as breakers lifted and dropped it. Vegetable wadding sealed the joints, and a large rowing crew drove the boat between roadstead ships and beach. Elsewhere, catamarans made from several logs lashed together provided fast, forgiving surfcraft. The English word catamaran derives, through Tamil, from a term for tied logs, though modern twin-hulled yachts are structurally different descendants of the name. On rivers and backwaters, dugouts, plank boats, and basket craft answered other conditions. Colonial observers frequently described these vessels through European categories and sometimes treated flexibility as poor workmanship. The survival of their own cargo on landing depended on local crews whose design knowledge those accounts underestimated. Chinese boat building developed numerous regional systems across rivers, canals, lakes, and seas. The label junk, adopted into European languages, is far too broad to define a single construction plan. Common features in many seagoing Chinese vessels included a flat or gently shaped bottom without a deep projecting keel, strong transverse bulkheads, stern-mounted rudders, and battened sails. Bulkheads divided the interior and could contribute structural stiffness. In some vessels, compartments were made substantially watertight, limiting flooding after local damage. Yet archaeological examples showed differences in fastening, plank arrangement, framing, and compartment sealing. Rivercraft optimized shallow draft and cargo access. Fujian seagoing ships differed from northern types. Official regulations, merchant preference, timber supply, and shipyard custom all shaped form. It is safer to speak of related traditions than of an unchanged Chinese ship invented at one date. The Quanzhou ship, buried near the port city on China's southeast coast and dated to the Song period, preserves a large section of a seagoing hull. Its structure includes a keel assembled in sections, layered planking in parts of the bottom, numerous bulkheads, and iron fastenings. Another famous wreck, Nanhai No. 1, sank in the South China Sea during the Southern Song period with a rich cargo. Its recovery inside a supporting caisson allowed excavation under controlled conditions, although conservation of the saturated hull remains difficult. These sites reveal sophisticated shipbuilding, but neither can stand for every Chinese vessel. They are seagoing traders from particular regions and decades. Korean and Japanese waters generated still other construction choices. Traditional Korean vessels often employed heavy bottom planks, robust transverse structure, and wooden fastenings suited to tidal coasts, shallow approaches, and local timber. Japanese coastal and riverboats included dugouts, plank-extended logboats, and later edge-fastened hulls whose seams and frames followed regional rules. During the early modern period, large Japanese coastal traders known as Pesse moved rice and other cargo around the archipelago. Their hulls, rigs, and operating practices responded to a cabotage network rather than blue water imperial expansion. Contact with Chinese, Korean, Ryukyuan, Southeast Asian, and European shipping introduced ideas, but adoption was selective. A borrowed sail or fastening enters a local craft system where tools, measurements, taxation, and inherited yard organization may reshape it. In mainland and island Southeast Asia, lashed-lug methods, doweled planks, sewn seams, and later iron fastenings overlapped across an enormous maritime zone. The Borobudur reliefs of 9th century Java depict outrigger ships with multiple strakes and complex rigs, but stone carving simplifies and stylizes. It confirms that substantial sailing vessels formed part of the sculptor's world without supplying every hidden joint. Wrecks in the Java Sea and adjacent waters preserve hull fragments whose interpretation continues to evolve. Some show Southeast Asian lashed-lug construction. Others reveal Chinese bulkheads or Western Indian Ocean sewing. Cargo may come from a region different from the hull, and a crew can be multilingual. Maritime archaeology is most valuable here when it resists assigning a ship's identity from one ceramic jar or one fastening. African boat histories extend far beyond the Egyptian Nile and Indian Ocean dhow and Indian Ocean dhow. On the Upper Nile and its tributaries, papyrus bundles, dugouts, and planked boats serve fishing, herding, transport, and warfare. Across the Congo Basin, builders carved large dugout canoes from forest trees, sometimes producing vessels capable of carrying many paddlers and heavy loads. On West African lagoons and rivers, canoe forms supported trade networks long before European arrival, and were then adapted to new cargoes, weapons, and coastal commerce. The Ghanaian fishing canoe, for example, begins from a dugout base enlarged with side planks, combining monoxylus and assembled construction. Painted names and emblems make each boat socially visible as well as technically functional. Outboard engines change stern structure and fishing range without making inherited hull knowledge irrelevant. Along the East African coast, Mepe vessels were sewn from planks and associated especially with Swahili maritime communities. Their flexible hulls and square mat sails belonged to coastal and island trade. By the 20th century, they had become rare. While nailed dhows and imported forms expanded, descriptions and photographs preserve outward appearance, but many gestures of construction disappeared with the last experienced builders. This is a recurring pattern. Technologies can leave detailed museum models at the moment they are already ceasing to support daily work. Models are valuable when their scale, maker, and purpose are documented. A commissioned ethnographic model may carefully reproduce stitching yet simplify internal structure. A votive or decorative model answers different questions. The historian must identify what kind of witness it is before treating it as a miniature ship. The Americas contained watercraft suited to nearly every aquatic environment. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous nations built great cedar dugouts for whaling, fishing, trade, ceremony, and travel through exposed coastal waters. Builders felled and hollowed trunks, then used fire, water, and spreading to widen and reshape the hull. High ends, flared sides, and carefully controlled rocker reflected use. The general word canoe should not erase named local types or ownership of knowledge. Farther south, Chumash communities on the California coast constructed the tomol from fitted planks sewn with fiber and sealed with bitumen. This labor-intensive craft supported crossings to the Channel Islands, fishing, exchange, and social institutions connected with specialist builders. Modern tomol projects are acts of cultural renewal led by Chumash people, not archaeological demonstrations available for outsiders to detach from community authority. In Arctic North America, frame and skin construction achieved forms closely matched to sea ice, cold water, and marine hunting. A kayak frame was measured in relation to its paddler in many traditions, making the craft an extension of reach, balance, and practiced movement. Joints lashed with sinew could articulate slightly rather than fracture under shock. Ribs were bent. Longitudinal stringers faired the shape, and deck beams established cockpit position and shear. Prepared skins were sewn so water pressure helped close rather than open vulnerable seams. The completed covering tightened as it dried. Harpoon lines, floats, deck fittings, and clothing worked with the hull as one hunting system. European and American designers later borrowed kayak-like forms for recreation, often replacing skin with canvas, plywood, fiberglass, or molded plastic. Similar silhouette does not transfer the cultural knowledge that produced the original craft. South American builders used dugouts throughout river systems, reed craft on highland lakes in the Pacific coast, and distinctive sewn plank boats in parts of Chile. The dowka of the Chono and neighboring peoples was assembled from planks joined with fiber, allowing components to be taken apart for difficult overland passages between waterways. Spanish colonists adopted and altered the type because it answered the archipelagic landscape better than many imported boats. On the Peruvian coast, small totora craft carried fishes through surf, while larger reef vessels appear in images and early accounts. Again, material decay leaves an incomplete chronology. A dry desert may preserve a model or fragment that a tropical riverbank loses within years. Apparent concentrations of invention sometimes map preservation more clearly than ancient creativity. The principle of joining wood with cordage therefore appears from Croatia to Oman, India, East Africa, the Pacific, and the Americas. But resemblance alone does not prove diffusion. Sewing is an accessible answer whenever planks, drills, and strong fiber are available while metal is scarce or undesirable. Specific stitch patterns, hole shapes, internal cleats, caulking, and building sequence may reveal closer relationships, especially when combined with language and dated distribution. Even then, contact can move in several directions. Boat builders travel, captured craftspeople carry knowledge, merchants commission familiar hulls abroad, and repair yards mix practices. A world map with arrows may be tempting, but evidence often supports a web of possibilities rather than one route. Northern European builders followed a different but equally complex path from expanded dugouts and sewn craft toward overlapping planked hulls. The jawed springboat, deposited in a bog on the Danish island of Als, around the 4th century before the Common Era, had a long, narrow hull assembled from a broad bottom plank and side planks sewn together. Cleats carved on inner surfaces accepted lashings that secured frames. Its projecting ends and light structure suited a paddled war canoe rather than a deep cargo ship. The deposition included weapons, suggesting a captured force and ritual context, although the exact event is unknowable. Short spring demonstrates refined plank assembly before iron rivets became characteristic of later Nordic ships. It also shows how the bottom of a vessel could grow from the idea of an expanded logboat while becoming fully composite. The Nidam ship, built around the early 4th century of the Common Era, and likewise deposited in what is now southern Denmark, marks a different stage. Its oak planks overlap in clinker fashion and are fastened with iron rivets. Frames are lashed to cleats, retaining a flexible connection between shell and skeleton. The ship was propelled by oars and had no mast. its long keel plank, rising end posts, and repeated strakes created a light shell that could carry many rowers. Iron did not instantly replace fiber. Both worked together. Rivets secured plank laps, while lashings attached internal support. This division allowed the shell to flex under wave loads. The vessel's preservation in a bog, like Hewitt Springs, resulted from deliberate deposition in anaerobic conditions, not typical abandonment. Most comparable ships were repaired, dismantled, burned, or decayed. Clinker construction builds the shell from longitudinal planks whose edges overlap. The lower plank is set. The next laps over it, and rivets or clenched nails secure the seam, often with a strand of animal hair or fiber bedded in a sealing compound. Each lap forms a small longitudinal stiffener. Builders shape planks by splitting straight oak rather than sawing through the grain whenever suitable trees and labor permit. Radially cleft boards follow fibers, producing strength at low thickness. An axe can then dress the surface and taper the ends. As strakes rise from keel toward gunwale, temporary spreaders, molds, or experienced control of plank twist establish form. Frames are fitted inside after much of the shell exists and attached with tree nails, lashings, or iron. The resulting hull is light, resilient, and repairable, though its stepped exterior and construction sequence differ from flush carvel work. Viking-age shipbuilders used clinker technique to produce vessels for strikingly different purposes. The 5 ships deliberately sunk near Skuld in Roskilde Fjord during the late 11th century include an ocean-going cargo carrier, a large warship, a smaller trader, a compact warship, and a fishing or transport boat. Their differences undermine the popular image of one universal longship. A cargo hull required beam and volume. A raiding or naval ship emphasized speed under oars and sail, shallow draft, and enough flexibility to survive in waves. Timber analysis shows that some vessels originated outside Denmark. Repairs and reused wood expose working lives rather than ceremonial perfection. The ships were finally filled with stone as part of a barrier in the channel. Tall pines supplied masts and spars, oak yielded keel and planking. Willow or other wood served tree nails according to project and region. Logs were cleft with wedges into sectors, then split repeatedly to produce boards. Broad axes brought each plank near final thickness. Scarfs joined lengths. Iron rivets passed through overlapping strakes and were clenched over small washers called roves. Once the shell reached sufficient height, fitted floor timbers and frames reinforced it. Crossbeams tied sides and supported deck arrangements. Woolen sailcloth demanded immense spinning and weaving before it ever reached the yard. Rope, tar, anchors, shields, oars, and stores multiplied the labor far beyond hull construction. Experimental work at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde makes this labor visible while remaining explicit about uncertainty. Reconstructions of the Skuld of ships use measured remains, comparable finds, historic Nordic craft, tool marks, and sailing trials. The large warship reconstruction known as Sea Stollion required many thousands of hours from boat builders, woodsmen, smiths, and other specialists. Its voyages explored steering, speed, crew organization, and the forces carried by hull and rig. The museum stresses that a reconstruction is an interpretation. Missing up a structure, sail qualities, and small fittings require choices. When trials expose a weakness, researchers must decide whether the problem lies in the ancient concept, the modern reconstruction, the material. Its voyages in Guyane. That humility is one of experimental archaeology's greatest strengths. Nordic clinker building became a long-lived family of traditions, extending far beyond the Viking Age. Coastal fishing boats, ferries and workboats in Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, and the North Atlantic continued to use overlapping planks in forms adapted to local seas. The recent recognition of Nordic clinker boat traditions as intangible heritage acknowledges communities of practice, not just ancient ships. A 19th-century Norwegian fairing and an 11th-century warship share construction principles without being the same design. Their builders worked within different markets, tools, timber supplies, and social organizations. Continuity appears in how a plank is lined off, how a lap is fastened, or how a hull is judged by eye. Change appears everywhere else. By the High Middle Ages, the cog had become an important cargo vessel around the North and Baltic seas. It was not invented in a single year, and vessels called cogs varied. But archaeological examples often share a flat or gently curved bottom, made from flush-laid planks, clinker-built sides, straight stem and stern posts, heavy transverse beams, and a single square sail. The flat bottom suited tidal shallows and allowed a ship to settle upright enough on mud when the water receded. High sides and an open hold provided cargo volume. Early steering arrangements used a side rudder. Later cogs helped spread the sternpost rudder in northern waters. This vertical rudder hung on hinges along the center line, freeing both sides and working with increasingly tall stern structures. It was one component in a changing system, not a lone device that transformed shipping by itself. Cod builders reconciled two different plank relationships within one hull. Bottom boards met edge to edge and were joined to floor timbers, while side strakes overlapped. Moss caulking compressed beneath battens and seams, and iron clamps or staples helped retain it. Large crossbeams projected through the sides, tying the hull and supporting deck structure. A massive keel was less important beneath the flat central bottom, although fore and aft shape rose sharply. The Bremen cog, dated to the late 14th century, preserves enough timber to reveal this arrangement in detail. Like other wrecks, it was deformed after sinking. Reconstructing the original hull required understanding which curves came from the builder and which from centuries under sediment. A museum display of reassembled timbers is therefore both artifact and analytical model. Northern towns needed cogs because bulk trade had grown. Grain, salt, timber, beer, cloth, wax, fish, and other commodities moved between ports linked to the Hanseatic world. A merchant hull's value lay in capacity, manageable crew size, and ability to use available harbors. Castles at bow and stern could provide fighting positions, but added windage and weight. Shipowners balanced defense against cargo. Cogs were joined by hulks, barges, clinker-built traders, and local boats that written records naming consistently. The vocabulary of medieval clerks does not map neatly onto archaeological categories. One document may classify by legal function, another by rig, burden, or place. A wreck should not receive a type name merely because its date and region seem convenient. In southern Europe, flush-planked carvel construction became increasingly important. The word derives from Iberian usage, but edge-to-edge planking had much older Mediterranean roots. What changed was the mature frame-led sequence and its movement into Atlantic shipbuilding. Keel, stem, and sternpost established the vessel's spine. Selected master frames set cross-sectional shape at key stations. Other frames were formed or fed between them using rib bands, rising squares, molding methods, and geometric rules. Planks then covered the skeleton with smooth exterior seams. Carvel construction avoided the stepped overlap of clinker and worked well for large, full-bodied ships. It also demanded a reliable method for creating fair-frame shapes before the shell existed to guide them. Mediterranean shipwrights used hole molding to generate related frame curves without drawing every section full size. A master mold, perhaps combined with rising and narrowing rules, could be adjusted systematically from the broad middle of a hull toward its ends. The exact procedures varied and much knowledge remained within yards. Later treatises described methods after they had already evolved for generations. Geometry gave repeatability, but builders still relied on battens, eye, and correction. Timber was never perfectly straight or uniform. Frames assembled from several futtocks had to follow intended curves while making good use of naturally bent pieces. The art lay in reconciling abstract proportion with grain visible in the wood. Islamic Mediterranean and Byzantine shipbuilding cannot be reduced to a bridge between Roman and European practice. Muslim-ruled ports supported shipyards from Iberia and North Africa to Egypt and the Levant, building merchantmen, galleys, river craft, and fleets. Written sources record arsenals, taxes, timber procurement, and naval campaigns, while wrecks reveal construction more directly. Latent sails, with long angled yards carrying triangular or quadrilateral cloth, gave useful control, but imposed powerful loads on mast and hull. Oars remained central to galleys. Builders adapted inherited Mediterranean carpentry as political centers and trade routes changed. Techniques moved across religious frontiers through captured vessels, migrant artisans, diplomacy, and commerce. The sea was a contact zone even during war. Venice turned ship construction into a celebrated system of state production. Its arsenal expanded from the medieval period into a vast enclosed complex containing slips, basins, ropeworks, foundries, timber stores, and specialized workshops. Galleys and sailing ships required standardized components and disciplined supply, although the popular image of a fully modern assembly line should be used carefully. Work could be divided among teams, fittings stocked, and hulls equipped in sequence. The state regulated forests and reserved particular trees. Timber was marked, transported by river and sea, sorted and seasoned. Rope demanded hemp. Sails consumed canvas. Ironwork depended on furnaces and charcoal. A fleet began in mountains, fields, and administrative records long before a keel was laid. Medieval Chinese state and commercial yards also built at scales that impressed foreign visitors. River and canal systems created demand for grain transports, ferries, watercraft, and government vessels. Seagoing trade under Song and Yuan rule connected ports to Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Ming expeditions in the early 15th century assembled large fleets under the command of Zheng He, but the dimensions of the greatest so-called treasure ships remain disputed. Later accounts and a large rudder post have supported dramatic estimates, while structural plausibility and contemporary evidence support caution. There is no need to exaggerate size to recognize exceptional organization. Supplying even a moderately large fleet with timber, iron, sails, water, food, crews, interpreters, and repair capability required enormous resources. Southeast Asian powers likewise deployed substantial regional ships. Javanese Zhong vessels described in early sources carried heavy cargo and sometimes artillery. Their exact dimensions and construction are debated, and European observers did not always understand local terminology. Some accounts suggest multiple plank layers and robust wooden fastenings. Maritime states around the Strait of Malacca, Java Sea, and South China Sea combined local hulls with imported guns, rigs, and trading practices. The arrival of Portuguese ships after 1498 did not introduce ocean sailing to an isolated region. It inserted heavily armed newcomers into networks, whose pilots and shipwrights already understood monsoons, reefs, currents, and long-distance exchange. Iberian exploration joined Mediterranean carval methods, Atlantic working craft, new rigs, and royal finance. The caravel began as a relatively small vessel and appeared in several forms, often with laden sails useful for maneuvering. Larger square-rigged oars and carracks carried cargo and provisions across oceans. No single ship embodied every voyage. Christopher Columbus's fleet in 1492 included vessels of different types. Portuguese voyages around Africa used changing combinations as routes became familiar. Hulls had to carry food and water for weeks, withstand ocean swell, and remain repairable abroad. Biofouling slowed them. Worms attacked unprotected wood, and leaking seams demanded constant pumping. A transoceanic ship was a moving workshop staffed by carpenters, caulkers, sailmakers, and sailors who could improvise with stores aboard. Hulls had to carry food, caulking. Strakes were spiked or tree-nailed to frames, leaving seams into which workers drove fibers such as oakum. Oakum was often made from old rope teased apart and impregnated with tar or pitch. Caulking irons and mallets compressed it to resist water without forcing planks dangerously apart. Pitch or other compounds sealed the surface. The task continued through a vessel's life as working open seams. Below the waterline, sacrificial boards, coatings, or later lead and copper sheathing fought marine organisms. Copper sheathing, adopted widely in 18th century navies, reduced weed and shipworm while creating galvanic problems when it interacted with iron fastenings. Technical gains routinely introduced new failure modes. Atlantic expansion made European shipbuilding part of conquest, coerced migration, and environmental extraction. Ships carried soldiers, settlers, missionaries, commodities, and diseases. They enabled the transatlantic slave trade, in which African captives were forced into holds designed and modified to maximize profit under murderous conditions. Boat history cannot treat hull efficiency as morally neutral achievement. Dimensions, ventilation, deck arrangements, water capacity, and security fittings were shaped by the violence a vessel was intended to perform. Colonial yards relied on enslaved, indentured, and poorly paid labor. Indigenous pilots guided unfamiliar coasts while imperial records often credited European commanders alone. Forests from the Baltic to the Caribbean and South Asia were brought into naval supply systems. The beauty of shipwright work coexisted with brutal uses of the finished ships. Early modern warships grew into multi-deck platforms for heavy guns. A cannon does not simply sit within a hull. Its weight bears on deck beams. Recoil transfers force into tackles and structure. Gun ports remove material from the side. Ammunition and powder require protected storage. And high batteries raise the center of gravity. Builders increased breadth, frame size, longitudinal reinforcement, and internal bracing. They added wales, thick bands of exterior planking, and riders inside older hulls. A ship could still become unstable if armament, upper works, ballast, and hull form were mismatched. The Swedish warship Vasa, completed in 1628, was tall, narrow, heavily armed, and insufficiently stable. A gust heeled it during its first voyage. Water entered open lower gun ports, and it sank after about 20 minutes. Its failure arose not from one foolish carpenter, but from design demands, changing supervision, limited stability calculation, and pressure within a royal program. Vasa's Stockholm yard employed around 400 people in many trades. Dutch shipwrights, German carvers, Walloon ironworkers, Swedish laborers, and imported materials made the ship an international product of state ambition. Timber came from estates and distant markets. Tar, hemp, coal, sailcloth, and fittings followed separate supply lines. The master shipwright Henrik Hybertson became ill and died before completion, leaving others to continue a changing project. A simple story says that workers used incompatible rulers, but the museum's research presents a more complicated workplace with multiple measurement systems and traditions. The finished hull was slightly asymmetrical, as handmade ships often were. Its survival after 3 centuries in Baltic mud lets researchers examine construction, carving, rigging, and the bodies and possessions of people aboard. The wreck is a shipyard archive, because catastrophe froze it before ordinary repair erased initial choices. The English warship Mary Rose had a very different career. Ordered in 1510 and built at Portsmouth, it served for more than 3 decades, undergoing rebuilding and changes in armament before sinking in 1545. The surviving starboard side shows massive oak framing and carvel planking, while thousands of objects reveal shipward work. Its long service warns against reading a final wreck as the builder's original design. Timbers were replaced, decks altered, guns updated, and loads changed. When raised in 1982, waterlogged wood presented severe conservation problems. The hull was first kept wet, then sprayed for years with polyethylene glycol, a wax-like substance that filled weakened cell spaces, before controlled drying. Boat building history now includes the engineered cradle and climate systems that prevent the ancient structure from deforming under its own weight. 17th and 18th century naval powers expanded permanent dockyards. Chatham, Portsmouth, Rochefort, Brest, Amsterdam, Havana, Karlskrona, Bombay, and other centers combined construction, repair, storage, and administration. A master shipwright no longer worked only for a local owner. He navigated contracts, official dimensions, surveyors, timber shortages, and political interference. Mold lofts allowed full-size body plans to be laid out on floors, producing templates for frames. Dockyard clerks tracked materials and wages. Specialized gangs sawed timber, shaped frames, bored pumps, made blocks, forged anchors, spun rope, and sewed sails. Women worked in sail-making, rope preparation, supply, and informal economies, even when official records foregrounded male trades. Children and apprentices carried tools, heated pitch, and learned hazardous tasks. Wood supply increasingly constrained naval policy. A mature oak suitable for a large compass timber might have begun growing generations before the ship that consumed it was conceived. Straight trunks yielded planking and beams. Naturally curved branches and roots furnished knees. State foresters marked trees, restricted private cutting, and encouraged plantations. Yet timber rights affected rural communities who depended on the same woods for fuel, grazing, pannage, tools, and buildings. Imported masts came from Baltic and North American forests. Tropical hardwoods entered colonial yards. Shipbuilding redistributed ecological pressure rather than eliminating it. An empire's fleet can be read in pollen records, forest laws, transport canals, and conflicts over common land. Design knowledge became more explicit as ships grew costly and states wanted repeatable results. 17th century builders began using drafts more regularly, though practical molding remained vital. 18th century naval architecture applied geometry and hydrostatics to displacement, stability, and resistance. Theoretical calculation did not immediately replace craft judgment. Hull lines had to be translated into molds, timbers, and fair surfaces. Builders corrected drawings where real wood refused ideal curves. Officers sometimes distrusted innovations that contradicted familiar sailing qualities. Model testing could compare forms. But scaling water resistance is difficult because wave making and friction do not change identically with size. Science entered the yard as another tool and authority, interacting with experienced hands rather than instantly commanding them. The molding loft became a place where these worlds met. Lines from a small drawing were expanded full size on a smooth floor. Shipwrights struck curves with long, flexible battens held by weights. From the resulting outlines, they made screeved boards or templates used to assemble frames. A slight unfairness visible in a full-size line might be invisible on paper. Lofting also coordinated parts made by different teams. A floor timber and its futtocks could be sided, molded, beveled, marked, and raised in the correct station. Standardization reduced ambiguity without making every piece interchangeable. Naturally grown timber still demanded individual attention. Only later, with iron and steel components manufactured to consistent dimensions, would interchangeability become a more complete industrial goal. Merchant shipbuilding followed incentives different from naval construction. Owners wanted capacity, low crew costs, speed sufficient for markets, and a hull that could survive insurance scrutiny. The Dutch flute, developed around the end of the 16th century, carried a large cargo with a relatively narrow upper deck and economical rig. Its shape is sometimes explained entirely as a response to tolls measured by deck width, but cargo efficiency and small crews mattered too. Flutes helped Dutch commerce while coexisting with many other types. Later packet ships emphasized schedules. East Indiamen balanced trade and defense. Whalers carried processing equipment and boats. And fishing vessels evolved around gear and grounds. Ship type emerged from business organization as much as hydrodynamics. In colonial North America, abundant timber encouraged yards from small river landings to major ports. White oak, live oak, pine, cedar, and locust served different roles. Live oak's dense, naturally curved branches became prized for naval frames, especially in the young United States. Sawmills increased plank supply, but adzes and axes remained central for shaping heavy members. A vessel might be built on speculation, with merchants deciding cargo and route after launch. Shipwrights moved between yards, spreading methods. Black artisans, including enslaved and free workers, contributed carpentry, caulking, sail-making, and waterfront labor, although documentation often obscures their names. Maritime prosperity depended upon this unequal labor system. South Asian dockyards became crucial to European empires because teak offered durability and resistance to rot and marine organisms. Indian shipwrights already built large trading vessels. The full companies commissioned naval and merchant ships. Bombay's Wadia family, among other Pesse builders, directed construction for the British East India Company and Royal Navy across generations. Their ships combined official requirements with local timber knowledge and yard practice. European officials sometimes praised teak vessels while denying equal status to the specialists who made them. Standard plans moved outward from imperial officers, but material behavior moved knowledge in the other direction. A drawing prepared for oak had to be reconsidered when built in teak, whose density, working qualities, seasoning, and fastening behavior differed. Across the Persian Gulf, Red Sea, Indian coast, and Southeast Asia, traditional yards continued beside imperial dockyards. A lanyesh might be laid down without a complete paper plan, its master using proportional rules and molds. A Sri Lankan yathra doni could retain sewn construction for regional trade. Indonesian Pinisi-associated building traditions developed plank-first methods and rigs within South Sulawesi communities, though the popular word Pinisi properly refers to a rig rather than every hull from the region. Heritage labels can freeze terminology that practitioners use more precisely. Modern motors, sawn timber, bolts, and synthetic caulking entered these yards selectively. A boat remains traditional, not because every tool is old, but because a community recognizes the practice and transmits its governing knowledge. The same is true of small European workboats. Pilot cutters, Cornish luggers, Scottish fishing boats, Thames barges, Norwegian fairings, and Mediterranean laden craft evolved rapidly when markets or regulations changed. Decking a formerly open boat improved safety but added weight. A new trawl required stronger towing points. Rail shipment favored dimensions that fit infrastructure. Engines reduced dependence on sail and altered stern shape, fuel storage, and working deck. Builders often began with a half model carved to represent one side of the hull. By separating the model into horizontal lifts, they could take off waterlines and transfer shape to drawings or the loft floor. The half model was both design tool and persuasive object shown to an owner. Launch day revealed whether months of work could move as one body. Large wooden ships were constructed on sloping stocks with keel blocks and shores carrying enormous weight. Workers greased launching ways with tallow on soap, transferred the hull onto a cradle, removed restraining supports and sequence, and released it toward the water. Too early a launch trapped builders. Too late risked structural strain on land. As the stern gained buoyancy while the bow remained supported, the hull experienced forces unlike those at sea. Calculations and reinforcement had to prevent damage. Crowds celebrated. Patrons broke bottles or followed local ceremonies, and workers watched for signs of failure that ceremony could not hide. After launch came masting, rigging, ballast, guns, stores, and trials. A hull entering water was a milestone, not a completed ship. Repair occupied more shipwright labor than famous new construction. Wooden hulls leaked, hogged, sagged, loosened fastenings, and suffered collision, grounding, storm, fire, rot, worms, and battle. Careening heeled a vessel to expose one side below the waterline when no dry dock was available. Graving docks enclosed a ship so water could be pumped out. Damaged planks were cut away and scarfed replacements fitted. Frames received sister timbers. Caulking was renewed. Masts were fished with reinforcing pieces. Old ships accumulated layers of intervention until their original structure survived only in patches. Archaeologists identify repairs through mismatched species, altered fastener holes, tool marks, and pieces cut around existing structure. Maintenance is not noise in the evidence. It is the record of how boats remained economically alive. Rigging also belongs to boat construction, even though rope and cloth rarely survive in wrecks. A mast transmits sail force into keelson, partners, shrouds, and hull. Standing rigging holds it upright. Running rigging controls yards and sails. Blocks turn lines and multiply force. The diameter, lay, and material of rope matter, because stretch changes mast loads. Sailcloth has weight, porosity, and shape. Woolen sails in Northern Europe behave differently from hemp, flax, cotton, palm mat, or modern synthetic cloth. A hull reconstructed without historically plausible rigging may sail in a way its timbers never did. Conversely, a copied sail plan placed on the wrong underwater shape can overload steering and stability. Vessel and rig must be studied as one machine. Boat builders learned from failure long before formal accident investigation. A plank split during bending, a new hull trimmed by the bow, a masthead crushed its floors, or a steering arrangement became unmanageable. Some corrections happened immediately with wedges, added ballast, or altered spars. Others entered yard memory. Never take a frame from that grain. Leave more wood beside this fastener. Ease the garbled plank before it lands hard against the keel. Success could also mislead. A familiar proportion extended to an unprecedented scale might change structural loads faster than intuition expected. Early modern states collected dimensions and sailing reports, partly to turn individual experience into institutional memory. The process remained political because admitting failure could threaten careers. Steam power entered this accumulated world rather than replacing it overnight. Early practical steamboats of the late 18th and early 19th centuries were usually wooden vessels carrying unfamiliar machinery: a boiler, engine, coal bunkers, shafts, and paddle wheels concentrated weight and vibration in places a sailing hull had not been designed to bear. Builders strengthened engine beds and floors, protected surrounding timber from heat, and left space for machinery that reduced cargo capacity. Side wheels made a vessel broad and exposed. A stern wheel suited shallower water but demanded a different afterbody. Masts and sails remained valuable when engines failed or coal was scarce. The first steam age therefore produced hybrids whose crews shifted between new power and old seamanship. River conditions encouraged designs unlike those for the open sea. On the Mississippi system, broad, shallow hulls carried large loads in little water, while high superstructures placed accommodation and cargo above the machinery. Their boilers could be powerful and dangerous. On European canals, locks fixed maximum dimensions more rigidly than ocean harbors did. Steam launches serving Asian ports and African rivers were sometimes shipped in pieces and assembled locally, making transportability part of design. Colonial authorities used shallow draft gunboats to project violence inland, so technical adaptation cannot be separated from conquest. Local builders also adopted engines for ferries, fishing, and trade on their own terms. Mechanization spread through many negotiations over fuel, spare parts, repair skills, and water depth. Iron hulls had precedence before they became normal. Iron barges and canal craft demonstrated that plates could form watertight surfaces, but ocean service posed harder questions about corrosion, compass deviation, working under waves, and the behavior of thousands of riveted joints. Timber was familiar, buoyant before being made into a hull, and repairable in ports with woodworking traditions. Iron was heavy as a raw material, yet its strength allowed thinner structural members and more internal volume. It did not rot or feed shipworm, though rust introduced a different decay. Early iron shipbuilders borrowed the language and layout of wooden construction. Frames resembled ribs, floor plates occupied the place of floors, and longitudinal members continued older functions even as their shapes changed. Rolling mills supplied plates whose size and consistency set practical limits. A ship's shell was assembled from overlapping strakes of iron plate, each punched or drilled for rows of rivets. Hot rivets were inserted, backed by a holder up on one side, and hammered into a second head on the other. Cooling contracted the shank and clamped the plates. Caulking an iron seam meant driving its plate edge tight, not packing fiber into a wooden gap. Riveting teams worked in noise and heat, often in confined positions. A sound joint depended upon hole alignment, plate contact, rivet temperature, and complete heading. The visible hull embodied a production chain extending back through mines, furnaces, rolling mills, pattern shops, and transport networks. The steamship Great Britain, launched at Bristol in 1843, became famous because it combined a very large iron hull with screw propulsion for ocean service. It was not the first iron ship, the first steamship, or the first screw-driven vessel. Its significance lay in bringing existing innovations together at unprecedented scale for Atlantic travel. Isambard Kingdom. Brunel's design team altered the machinery plan after deciding upon a screw rather than paddle wheels. The propeller freed the sides from wheel boxes and worked below the water, but required a long shaft, an opening through the stern, and bearings kept in alignment by a hull that flexed. The ship's later career, grounding, conversions, and eventual preservation also shows that an icon is not a frozen moment of invention. The screw propeller reshaped hulls gradually. Its thrust had to pass through a thrust bearing into the structure rather than merely spinning water behind the ship. The sternpost, shaft alley, and aperture around the propeller became a coordinated design problem. Engineers debated blade number, pitch, diameter, and rotational speed, learning from trials as well as theory. Naval vessels valued a propeller protected beneath the waterline, and merchant owners valued deck space no longer occupied by paddle boxes. Yet paddlers survive where shallow draft, debris, maintenance, or maneuverability favored them. Technological history is rarely a race with a single finish line. It is a sorting of compromises among routes. Brunel's Great Eastern, launched in 1858 after severe construction and financial difficulties, pushed iron shipbuilding toward another scale. Its double hull arrangement and longitudinal cellular structure departed from ordinary practice, while both paddle wheels and a screw drove the enormous vessel. It proved capable of carrying enough coal for long voyages and later laid submarine telegraph cables, but it failed commercially as the passenger liner imagined by its promoters. The launch itself had to move the hull sideways into the Thames because the yard lacked room for a conventional end launch. Great Eastern demonstrated structural possibilities without instantly establishing a standard. Exceptional ships reveal experiments. They should not be mistaken for typical fleets. Wooden construction continued to evolve in response. Composite ships used iron frames with wooden planking, combining a lighter internal skeleton with an outer surface that could receive copper sheathing without the severe galvanic problems created when copper contacted an iron hull. The T-clippers of the mid-19th century used fine entrances, ample sail area, disciplined rigging, and carefully built hulls to compete for high-value cargo. Cutty Sark, launched in 1869, is a celebrated survivor of this composite method. Not a representative of every merchant ship, clippers depended upon commercial timing and skilled crews as much as shape. Steamships in the Suez Canal changed their economic setting, but sailing cargo vessels remained useful on routes where coal costs outweighed speed. Steel displaced wrought iron in major shipbuilding during the later 19th century, as industrial processes made it cheaper and more reliable. Steel offered greater strength for a given weight, enabling larger ships or more cargo. But yards could not simply substitute it without revising scantlings and workshop routines. Classification societies and naval authorities specified acceptable grades, tests, and dimensions. Plates were bent on rolls or pressed to complex curvature. Angle bars and bulb profiles formed frames and beams. Hydraulic tools reduced some hand labor. Pneumatic riveting hammers later accelerated fastening while multiplying industrial noise. A modern material still required judgment because overheated rivets, sharp structural discontinuities, poor drainage, or inaccessible paintwork could begin future failure. The shift to metal changed fairness. A wooden plank could be sprung into a long visual curve, then adzed or planed until a shipwright's eye approved it. Metal plates arrived as flat products whose developed shapes had to match a three-dimensional hull. Mold loft workers expanded small drawings full size on a loft floor, corrected intersections, and prepared templates for frames and plates. Screeveboards recorded frame sections. Battens revealed where the lines ran smoothly. A mistake in lofting propagated into holes that did not meet on the slipway. Lofts therefore stood between designers and workshops, translating geometry into cut material. Their specialists held unusual power because they understood both drawing conventions and production realities. Naval armor intensified the challenge. Mid-19th century warships combined steam machinery, guns, armor plate, timber backing, and metal structure in rapidly changing arrangements. France's Glare and Britain's Warrior, both entering the story around 1860, are often presented as markers of the ironclad era. Yet wooden-hulled armored vessels and coastal craft remained in service. Turrets altered weight distribution and firing arcs. Rams briefly returned to strategic attention. Later battleships concentrated massive guns, boilers, magazines, armor belts, and subdivision inside steel hulls. Warship construction became a state-supported system of ordnance works, engine makers, armor mills, electrical firms, and dockyards. Its technical achievements were inseparable from arms races and imperial coercion. Merchant safety produced a different network of rules. Lloyd's Register and other classification societies surveyed materials, construction, and condition so insurers and shippers could judge risk. Their rules did not design every ship, nor did a class certificate guarantee safety. They established minimum relationships among dimensions, structure, machinery, and intended service. National load line laws addressed dangerous overloading, eventually making a marked limit visible on the hull. International agreements followed major losses, especially in the 20th century. Regulation often arrived after tragedy and remained contested by owners concerned about cost. A shipbuilder thus worked for an owner while also answering to surveyors, government inspectors, port constraints, and the sea. Metal construction separated trades more sharply without removing craft. Shipfitters placed frames and plates. Riveters formed gangs. Caulkers sealed seams. Pattern makers made wooden forms for castings. Foundry workers produced stern frames and propellers. Boiler makers assembled pressure vessels. Machinists finished shafts and bearings to precise tolerances. Joiners fitted cabins into a steel shell. Electricians later threaded power and communication throughout the vessel. Crane drivers choreographed heavy lifts. Drawings and job cards coordinated them. But informal conversations still resolved clashes. A pipe shown passing through a beam could not occupy the same space as structure, however confident the drawing appeared. Propulsion rearranged the ship from within. Compound and then triple expansion steam engines extracted energy through successive cylinders, reducing coal consumption. Water tube boilers offered high power but demanded careful operation. Steam turbines demonstrated at high speed by Turbinia in 1897. Delivered smooth rotation and transformed fast warships and liners. Diesel engines spread in the early 20th century because they could be efficient and eliminated boilers, though adoption varied by vessel type. Each system imposed its own foundations: ventilation, exhaust, fuel storage, cooling, maintenance clearances, and vibration. Naval architecture increasingly meant integrating specialized systems rather than shaping an empty container around cargo. Scientific design methods grew alongside towing tanks. William Froude's 19th-century experiments helped establish ways to relate resistance measured on a model to a full-size ship, distinguishing wave-making effects from frictional ones. Model testing did not eliminate uncertainty. Water cannot be scaled in every physical property at once, and appendages, roughness, wind, and loading complicate prediction. Stability calculations develop from geometry and weight estimates, while inclining experiments measured an actual ship after launch. Structural theory treated a long hull as a beam moving across wave crests and troughs. These tools formalized questions builders had always confronted, but reliable results still depended on accurate weights, assumptions, and construction. Welding began to replace riveting unevenly during the early 20th century. An electric arc fused prepared plate edges, removing the overlap and rivet weight of many older joints. Welded structure could be lighter and easier to prefabricate, yet it introduced heat distortion, residual stress, crack sensitivity, and a need for new inspection. Some yards and surveyors distrusted early work. Others adopted it for particular structures before whole hulls. Riveted and welded connections coexisted for decades. Training mattered because a weld that looked smooth on the surface could conceal lack of fusion or porosity. Material composition also mattered. Construction method, steel toughness, detail shape, and temperature interacted in failures that no single culprit explains. The two world wars accelerated standardization and production while consuming ships and lives on an immense scale. During the First World War, fabricated sections and standardized merchant designs expanded output. In the second, American Liberty ships became the best-known example of welded mass production. More than 2,700 were completed between 1941 and 1945 by many yards, some established and others built for the program. Blocks were assembled in separate areas, lifted together, and welded on the ways. Repeated designs allowed workers to learn a bounded set of tasks, and women and migrants entered jobs previously restricted to narrower groups. Publicity celebrated record launch times. That fitting out a usable ship took longer than a ceremony suggested. Several welded wartime ships suffered serious fractures, including hulls that broke apart. Investigations connected the problem to brittle steel behavior at low temperatures, stress concentrations at square openings or flawed details, welding defects in some cases, and cracks that could travel farther through continuous welded structure than through riveted seams. The lesson was not that welding itself was a mistake. Improved steel toughness, rounded details, crack arresters, revised inspection, and better procedures made welded ships dependable. These failures helped develop fracture mechanics, a field that treats tiny cracks and local stresses as system-level risks. Here, disaster became part of the engineering record, though at human and economic cost. Wartime demand also transformed small craft production. Landing craft were designed for manufacturing great numbers and for beaching under fire. Patrol boats used plywood and laminated wood where lightness and non-strategic materials were valuable. Higgins Industries adapted shallow draft craft with a bow ramp into landing boats central to Allied amphibious operations, while many other firms built specialized types. Assembly line language can obscure the hand skill involved in fitting engines, fastening plywood, coating seams, and adjusting machinery. Standard parts reduced variation, but boats operated in mud, surf, tropical heat, and cold seas that exposed every shortcut. Plywood changed what a wooden hull could be. Instead of relying on a thick plank whose fibers ran in one main direction, manufacturers glued thin veneers with alternating grain. The resulting sheet resisted splitting and could cover broad areas with fewer seams. Early waterproof glues were crucial. Interior-grade bonding would delaminate in marine service. Builders developed hard chine hulls whose flat or singly curved panels suited sheets. Stitched and glued amateur boats later joined panels with wire or plastic ties before sealing the seams in epoxy and glass tape. Plywood did not make design foolproof. Exposed end grain trapped moisture. Inadequate coating and poorly supported joints could still destroy a hull. Cold molded construction pursued compound curves with multiple diagonal layers of thin veneer laid over a form and bonded together. Earlier versions used nails and casein or resorcinol adhesives. Epoxy later improved gap filling and moisture resistance. The crossing grain produced a light shell that acted more like a laminated skin than ordinary carvel planking. Hot molding used heat and pressure for factory products such as wartime aircraft and certain boats. Strict planking offered another route, joining narrow wooden strips edge to edge before fairing, and often sheathing them. These methods blurred the line between timbercraft and composite engineering. Wood remained anisotropic and moisture-sensitive even when enclosed in resin. Glass-reinforced plastic, often called fiberglass, moved from experiments to widespread boat production after the Second World War. Fine glass fibers carried tensile load, while polyester, vinyl ester, or epoxy resin held them in shape and transferred stress. A builder first made a full-sized plug, then a smooth female mold. Gel coat, reinforcement, and resin were applied inside the mold. By hand layup, spray, vacuum infusion, or later automated methods. Once cured, many nearly identical hulls could be released. This shifted investment from each hull to tooling and favored production runs. Complex curves, built-in color, and freedom from plank seams attracted buyers, but the material was never maintenance-free. Early fiberglass boats were often built thick because long-term behavior was uncertain. Later laminates became more efficient and sometimes more vulnerable to poor workmanship. Too much resin added weight without proportional strength, too little left dry fibers. Air pockets, print-through, weak secondary bonds, water intrusion, and osmotic blistering emerged as failure modes. Sandwich construction placed a light core of balsa or foam between strong skins, greatly increasing stiffness, yet a leaking fitting could saturate or crush the core. Inspectors learned to tap, scan, and sample laminates, while designers accounted for fiber direction. Unlike a homogeneous metal plate, a composite could be strong along one path and weak across another. Aluminum offered light weight, corrosion resistance in the right alloy, and straightforward fabrication for ferries, patrol craft, fishing boats, and small recreational vessels. It forms a protective oxide layer, but galvanic contact with more noble metals and seawater can cause aggressive local corrosion. Welding heat reduces strength near some joints unless design and alloy selection compensate. Thin plating may fatigue around hard spots. Aluminum yards control contamination because embedded steel particles can rust and stain or initiate trouble. The material works especially well where speed and payload reward reduced weight, yet it demands electrical isolation, careful coatings, and knowledgeable repair. Ferrocement used a dense mesh of steel rods and wire, covered with rich cement mortar. It had 19th century precedents and attracted renewed interest for barges, fishing boats, and amateur cruising yachts, especially where timber or industrial plate was scarce. Properly executed, the thin composite shell could be durable and fire-resistant. Poor mortar penetration, excessive weight, corrosion around exposed reinforcement, and difficult quality control damaged its reputation. Inflatable craft represented an opposite strategy. Flexible coated fabric formed tubes that gained stiffness from air pressure. Rigid inflatable boats combined buoyant collars with a shaped hull. Neither method was universally superior. Each answered a distinct relationship among cost, transport, impact, load, and repair. Motorization altered local boat building far beyond industrial yards. A sailing fishing boat converted to an engine needed more than a hole for a shaft. Builders strengthened the engine bed, changed ballast, supplied fuel and cooling, arranged ventilation, and sometimes enlarged the rudder or modified the stern. Machinery increased predictable mobility, but also required purchased fuel and imported parts. Communities that had once made nearly every component from nearby materials became tied to distant supply chains. A faster boat could reach new grounds and land fresher catch, while also enabling heavier fishing pressure. The design change therefore reshaped labor, debt, ecology, and relations between ports. Outboard motors encouraged another family of forms. Their compact power unit could be clamped to a transom, removed for repair, and tilted in shallow water. Flat-bottomed skiffs, aluminum runabouts, fiberglass pangas, and long, narrow riverboats adapted to locally available engines. In parts of Southeast Asia, a long-tail arrangement placed an automobile-derived engine on a pivoting shaft, allowing its propeller to reach past weeds and shoals. Such boats are sometimes portrayed as improvised deviations from formal naval architecture. In reality, they are precise responses to cost, maintenance access, cargo, and water conditions. Standard engines became ingredients in highly regional design. The 20th century fishing vessel also absorbed refrigeration, hydraulic winches, sonar, radar, steel wire, and synthetic nets. These systems changed deck layout and stability. A net piled high or a catch brought aboard could raise the center of gravity. Free water on deck could shift suddenly. Enclosed shelters protected crews while adding windage and top weight. Trawlers needed strong towing points and clear paths for gear. Purseaners organized space around skiffs and power blocks. Long liners managed kilometers of hooks. A hull cannot be understood apart from the work sequence it supports, and tragic capsizings repeatedly showed the cost of adding equipment without recalculating the whole vessel. Containerization transformed large merchant hulls after the standardized freight container gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s. Holds became rectangular cells with guides, hatch openings widened, and deck structures carried stacked boxes. Cranes, terminals, trucks, and schedules formed part of the system. A container ship alone could not create container trade. Bulk carriers optimized large, unobstructed holds for ore or grain. Tankers separated liquid cargo into tanks whose loading sequence affected bending and stability. Roll-on, roll-off ships used ramps and broad vehicle decks, creating vulnerable open spaces if water entered. Specialization improved handling efficiency while producing distinctive structural and safety problems. Modern ship construction moved increasingly from an inclined slipway to a building dock. Instead of assembling almost every piece around a keel in one place, yards fabricated panels and three-dimensional blocks in workshops. A block might contain frames, bulkheads, pipes, cable trays, ladders, and painted compartments before a transporter carried it to the dock. Giant cranes joined these sections into a hull. Dimensional control became critical. A few millimeters of error, repeated across interfaces, could prevent pipes and structures from meeting. Survey instruments, reference points, and digital models helped. But weld shrinkage and gravity continued to move real steel. Numerically controlled cutting machines read nesting plans that arranged parts efficiently on plate. Plasma, oxy-fuel or laser systems cut edges and marked identification. Automated panel lines welded stiffeners to flat plate. Robots handled some repetitive seams, especially where geometry was accessible. Curved shell plates were rolled or pressed and checked against templates or digital measurements. The production model described not only final shape, but also assembly sequence. Designers had to decide where blocks would separate, which welds remain reachable, how a module could be lifted, and whether temporary reinforcement was needed. Build strategy became part of design from the beginning. Computer-aided design changed drawing without abolishing translation. Three-dimensional product models can coordinate structure, piping, ventilation, electrical routes, accommodation, machinery, and access. Interference software detects two objects occupying one location, yet it cannot always judge whether a worker can install a valve or remove a pump years later. Virtual reality may let crews review spaces before steel is cut. Computational fluid dynamics estimates water and airflow. Finite element analysis estimates structural stress. These methods make complexity visible, but their images can appear more certain than their assumptions justify. A sophisticated calculation built on an incorrect load or boundary condition remains incorrect. The largest commercial ships are products of global industry. An owner in one country may commission a design from another, finance it elsewhere, select an engine made under license on a different continent, and build at a yard supplied by multinational firms. Flags, classification, and crew nationality add other jurisdictions. East Asian yards came to dominate much large vessel output during the late 20th and early 21st centuries through investment, industrial policy, skilled labor, and supply networks. European yards retained strengths in cruise ships and specialized vessels, while many countries maintain naval or repair capacity. No national label fully contains the knowledge embedded in one hull. Cruise ships demonstrate integration at extreme density. Their hulls contain propulsion plants, freshwater production, sewage treatment, galleys, theaters, cabins, elevators, ventilation, fire zones, and evacuation routes for thousands of people. Large openings and tall superstructures complicate strength and wind response. Interior modules may be prefabricated ashore and slid into place. Decorative finishes must meet fire rules that ordinary buildings do not face in the same way. The vessel resembles a moving city, but unlike a city, it bends in waves and must remain stable after specified damage. Hotel design and naval architecture negotiate every deck. Submarines reverse many familiar priorities. Their pressure hull resists external water pressure rather than merely keeping waves outside. Circular sections distribute load efficiently, and weld quality is critical, because small flaws can grow under repeated dives. An outer hydrodynamic form may surround ballast tanks and equipment. Weight control becomes exceptionally strict. Added mass must be balanced, and its position affects trim. Military secrecy limits the historical record, while deep-diving research submersibles use different scales and missions. Their construction still belongs to the long history of watercraft, because builders shape material to create habitable space in water. Only now the vessel travels within the medium rather than mainly upon it. High-speed craft explore the boundary between displacement and lift. Planing hulls rise partly onto the surface, reducing immersed volume as speed increases. Hydrofoils use submerged wings to raise the hull clear of much wave drag. Air-cushioned vehicles ride over water and land on contained pressure, while surface effect ships combine a cushion with side hulls. Each arrangement transfers loads into structure differently and reacts differently to waves. Lightweight aluminum or composite materials often become important because excess mass defeats the concept. Speed gains may bring high fuel consumption, difficult motion, noise, and demanding maintenance, reminding designers that one performance number never measures an entire boat. Recreational boat building created markets for standardized pleasure craft and spaces for individual experimentation. Mass-produced dinghies and yachts made sailing available beyond owners who could commission a custom yard, though access still followed income and geography. One design classes fixed important dimensions, so competition depended less on buying a unique hull. Amateur plan sets, kits, and magazines spread methods such as plywood chines and strip planking. At the luxury end, carbon fiber, aramid fiber, foam cores, autoclaves, and precision molds pursued lightness and stiffness at enormous cost. Racing rules encouraged innovations and loopholes, sometimes producing fragile designs optimized for a measurement system rather than ordinary service. Carbon fiber composites can align very strong, stiff fibers along calculated load paths. Vacuum bagging removes excess resin and compacts layers. Resin infusion draws liquid through dry reinforcement. Pre-preg materials arrive with controlled resin content and cure under specified heat. Core materials separate skins, and local reinforcements distribute mast, keel, and foil loads. Quality assurance may use ultrasound, thermography, or witness samples because internal defects are hard to see. Repair requires knowing the original laminate schedule and restoring fiber continuity. A black glossy surface can conceal abrupt changes in direction where loads concentrate. Advanced materials reward precision and punish casual assumptions. Keels and masts became separate engineering fields within yacht construction. A deep ballast keel produces righting moment through weight at a lever arm, but its attachment transmits severe cyclic loads into the hull. Canting keels, dagger boards, and hydrofoils and bearings, hydraulics, and control systems. Aluminum masts replaced much wooden spars. Carbon spars reduced weight aloft and altered rig response. Standing rigging progressed from natural fiber through wire to high-strength synthetic or composite elements. Every weight saved above the waterline can improve stability, yet failure may be sudden. The boat builder now coordinates specialists whose components interact through a thin shell. Lifeboats show how purpose can dominate elegance. 19th century self-righting boats use buoyancy compartments, heavy keels, and arrangements intended to recover after capsize. Launching from a beach demanded carriages and strong local crews. Motor lifeboats extended range, enclosed wheelhouses, protected crews. Modern all-weather boats combine watertight subdivision, powerful engines, shock-resistant seating, navigation electronics, and carefully studied motion. Shipboard survival craft face other constraints. They must carry many people, lower safely from height, start after long neglect, and survive fire or rough water. A rarely used boat may be the one whose reliability matters most. Design for damage distinguishes much regulated shipbuilding. Watertight bulkheads divide the hull so one breach does not flood every space. Double bottoms protect against some groundings and carry tanks, fire boundaries, redundant pumps, emergency power. Escape routes and remote shutoffs address cascading hazards. Probabilistic damage stability rules estimate many possible breaches rather than one idealized accident. Designers must also prevent the protective feature from causing a new problem. A subdivision arrangement can trap water high in the ship, and a sealed escape route may be unusable in smoke. Safety emerges from link systems, maintenance, drills, and human decisions, not from a single strong hull. Inspection begins before material reaches the yard. Steel certificates record chemical and mechanical properties. Selected samples undergo tensile, bend, impact, or fracture tests. Weld procedures are qualified for material, thickness, position, and process. Inspectors use radiography, ultrasound, magnetic particles, dye penetrant, or visual examination according to the joint and risk. Tanks are tested for leaks. Machinery is aligned and turned. Electrical insulation is checked. Harbor and sea trials measure propulsion, steering, stopping, noise, vibration, navigation, and emergency functions. Passing a trial confirms performance under tested conditions, not immunity from aging or misuse. Corrosion control is itself construction. Steel is blasted clean, primed, and covered by coating systems selected for immersion, cargo, heat, or weather. Sacrificial anodes made from more reactive metal corrode in place of protected structure. Impressed current systems apply controlled electricity. Ballast tanks are especially difficult because salt water, condensation, complex stiffeners, and limited access create vulnerable corners. Anti-fouling coatings discourage organisms that increase drag or damage surfaces. But toxic ingredients can harm ecosystems. Regulations have prohibited some compounds and pressured manufacturers toward alternatives. The underwater surface is thus a managed chemical boundary between industry and ocean life. Maintenance planning increasingly begins in the digital model. Access openings, lifting points, removable panels, inspection routes, and spare clearances determine whether a component can be serviced. A pump installed before surrounding structure closes may be impossible to replace unless designers anticipate its path. Condition monitoring tracks vibration, oil debris, temperature, coating breakdown, and structural fatigue. Dry docking exposes the hull for cleaning and survey. Thickness gauges measure metal loss to corrosion. Cracks may be ground out and re-welded. Wasted plate is cropped and renewed. Like wooden predecessors with sisted frames and replaced planks, modern ships become records of repair. Shipbreaking completes a vessel's material cycle, often under harsh conditions. Equipment may be reused, steel recycled, and non-ferrous metals recovered. Hazardous insulation, oils, paints, refrigerants, and residues make dismantling dangerous. Much 20th century breaking shifted to beaches in South Asia, where tidal access and low labor costs enabled ships to be cut apart with limited infrastructure, exposing workers and shorelines to serious harm. Other facilities used piers or dry docks with stronger containment. A history concerned only with launch misses this final yard, where design choices made decades earlier determine how safely materials can be separated. Composite disposal poses a different problem, because cured resin and reinforcing fibers are difficult to divide. Old fiberglass hulls may be abandoned, buried, crushed as filler, or processed through emerging recycling methods. Thermoset resin cannot simply be melted and remolded like many thermoplastics. Designers are experimenting with recyclable matrices, natural fibers, modular parts, and clearer material records. Wooden boats store biological carbon while they last, but harvesting, adhesives, coatings, and short service life complicate simple claims of greenness. Steel and aluminum require energy to produce but have mature recycling streams. Environmental comparison must count construction, operation, repair, and end of life. Fuel consumption usually dominates the lifetime impact of a large powered ship. Builders reduce resistance through hull form refinement, smooth coatings, propeller improvement, air lubrication experiments, wind assist rotors or sails, and care for weight control. Engines may burn lower carbon fuels, or use batteries and fuel cells on routes where storage and charging permit. Ammonia, methanol, hydrogen, biofuels, and synthetic fuels each create questions of production, toxicity, volume, fire, and infrastructure. There is no material switch that solves shipping emissions by itself. A vessel's speed, cargo utilization, route, and port system can matter as machinery selected. The evidence used to tell this history is also constructed through skilled work. An underwater archaeologist rarely encounters a tidy ship resting upright with every component attached. Storms scatter light objects, currents abrade edges, shipworm consumes exposed timber, fishing gear drags material, and salvage removes valuable pieces. Sediment may protect the lower hull while everything above it disappears. Excavators establish a grid or a network of fixed control points, record the position and orientation of each find, and uncover layers slowly. Photogrammetry combines overlapping images into a measured three-dimensional surface. Sonar maps objects in dark or turbid water, but an acoustic shape still requires interpretation. Timber recording can reveal an absent construction sequence. A notch shows where another member once crossed. An unused fastening hole may belong to a layout revised during building. Compression around a nail records the direction from which it was driven. Tool facets distinguish sawing, hewing, adzing, planing, or chiseling. Grain direction helps explain why a naturally curved crook served as a frame. Archaeologists draw each face, measure bevels, identify scarfs, and compare mirrored or repeated parts. When timbers cannot be raised, divers may record them in place and rebury the site beneath protective material. Dendrochronology compares the pattern of wide and narrow tree rings with dated regional sequences. When enough rings and a suitable reference exist, it can date the growth of a timber and sometimes indicate the forest region. The outermost sapwood or bark edge is needed for the closest estimate of felling. A squared beam missing many external rings gives only a date after which it was cut. Wood species identification reveals selection and trade, but not necessarily a ship's home port, because timber traveled. Isotopic or genetic methods may refine origin in favorable cases. Each technique narrows possibilities rather than reading a builder's identity directly from wood. Fasteners provide another clock with imperfect hands. A clenched nail, tree nail, lashing channel, copper rivet, iron spike, or welded seam belongs to a technological range, yet old methods can persist and old vessels can receive new repairs. Corrosion often expands an iron fastening until surrounding wood splits, then leaves only a void or mineral crust. X-rays expose forms hidden inside concretions. Chemical analysis can distinguish alloys and slag patterns, but recycled metal mixes histories. Coins, ceramics, and cargo may date a wreck's loss more closely than its construction. The launch and sinking of a vessel are separate events that can be decades apart. Reconstructing an incomplete hull requires explicit choices. If only the bottom survives, side height, shear, deck arrangement, and rig may remain uncertain. Researchers compare contemporary images, texts, related wrecks, and regional boats, then test whether proposed lines fit the surviving joints. A digital model can show several alternatives instead of hiding uncertainty inside one persuasive image. Hydrostatic analysis checks displacement and stability, but the weight of missing cargo and equipment must be estimated. Reconstructions are strongest when they publish which features are observed, which are closely supported, and which are conjectural. Full-sized experimental vessels ask questions that drawings cannot. Builders discover how long a plank can be twisted before it splits, how many people move a hull, which tool reaches a concealed joint, and where lashing must be tightened during launch. Sailing trials reveal steering balance, speed range, leeway, motion, and crew coordination. The 5 reconstructions associated with the Skulldalev wrecks at Roskilde, for example, have generated practical evidence about distinct Viking-age ship types. Yet a successful voyage proves that one reconstruction can work. It does not prove that the original always carried the same rig, followed the same route, or achieved the same measured speed. Replica projects also expose modern intrusions. Contemporary safety rules may require radios, life jackets, hidden engines, or stronger scantlings. Modern timber may grow differently from old-growth wood. Steel tools can replace iron-edged originals. Synthetic rope may stretch less than plant fiber. Crews may lack lifelong familiarity. Researchers can document these differences and isolate variables, but cannot erase them. Failure remains useful. If a reconstructed steering oar breaks, investigators ask whether the timber, grain, dimensions, sea state, or interpretation was wrong rather than treating the original builders as incompetent. Once waterlogged wood is raised, conservation becomes an urgent extension of excavation. The cells of buried timber may contain water where biological material has degraded. If that water evaporates untreated, surface tension can collapse the weakened structure, causing severe shrinkage and distortion. Conservators keep pieces wet, remove salts and contaminants, and introduce bulking agents over long periods. Polyethylene glycol, usually abbreviated by saying each letter, has been used to replace or support water in wood from ships such as Vasa and Mary Rose. Controlled drying and continuing environmental management then protect the treated structure. There is no moment when preservation simply ends. Vasa, raised in 1961 after sinking in Stockholm Harbour in 1628, was sprayed with polyethylene glycol for years before slow drying. Its survival offers an extraordinary view of a 17th-century warship, including structure, sculpture, tools, possessions, and human remains. It also presents continuing chemical and mechanical problems. Sulfur compounds accumulated in the wood during burial. Iron catalyzes reactions, and the enormous hull changes shape under its own weight. Sensors, adjustable supports, climate control, and chemical research are now part of the ship's life. What visitors see is both an early modern vessel and a modern conservation system. Mary Rose sank during battle in 1545 and was raised in 1982 after extensive underwater work. Much of one side survived beneath sediment, producing a cross-section through a Tudor warship and its community. Conservators used a long program of spraying, first with water and then with grades of polyethylene glycol, followed by controlled drying. Thousands of individual objects required their own treatments. The whole does not provide a complete symmetrical blueprint, and interpretations have changed as recording and analysis improved. Its value lies partly in that openness. Evidence can revise a familiar national story. Preservation in place may be better than recovery. Raising a wreck removes it from the burial environment that enabled survival and commits future institutions to high expense. Covering exposed timbers with geotextile and sediment can reduce oxygen and erosion. Protective zones may restrict anchoring or trawling. Site monitoring observes biological attack and sediment movement. Decisions involve archaeologists, governments, fishers, divers, local residents, and descendant or indigenous communities. A wreck may be scientific evidence. A grave. A livelihood obstacle. A tourism site or stolen heritage at the same time. Technical capacity alone does not confer the right to recover it. Museum display can distort scale and labor by isolating a beautiful hull from the forest. Quarry, fiber plot. A rup, walk, sail loft, and community. Labels centered on an admiral or designer may leave unnamed sawyers, caulkers, riveters, enslaved workers, women provisioning yards, and families maintaining boats. Archaeology sometimes retrieves their traces in fingerprints on caulking, repaired shoes, food remains, toolware, or hurried alterations. Written contracts reveal wages and hierarchy, but usually describe official arrangements rather than every act. A responsible account keeps the celebrated vessel connected to ordinary and coerced work. Living boat-building traditions are not fossils left behind by industrial progress. In the Caroline Islands, wayfinding and canoe-making join hull construction to star knowledge. Ocean swell, weather, social teaching, and responsibility between generations. Pacific voyaging revivals have built and sailed large canoes to renew languages and relationships damaged by colonization. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia continue or revive bark canoe, dugout, and sewn craft knowledge according to local authority. Arctic builders adapt skin boat principles to available materials. Documentation should support community control rather than extracting techniques as anonymous data. The same caution applies to the word traditional. A boat builder may use a chainsaw to rough a dugout, nylon line to lash a component, a phone to coordinate a launch, and inherited proportions to determine shape. Declaring the result inauthentic because one tool is modern mistakes tradition for reenactment. At the same time, tourism or heritage programs may simplify practice into a marketable image and change who can afford materials. Builders decide which adaptations preserve the core of their craft. Outsiders can record those decisions, but should not appoint themselves final judges of continuity. Apprenticeship transmits more than instructions. A learner watches how a master stands to sight a curve, hears the sound of a tight fastening, smells overheated wood during bending, and feels when an adze begins to follow grain. Corrections may arrive as a gesture rather than an explanation. Repetition develops speed, but participation in repair develops diagnosis. Formal schools and digital archives can preserve plans and interviews, while only active yards reproduce the chain of judgment. Supporting boat-building heritage therefore means creating occasions to build, maintain, and use boats, not merely storing one completed example. Modern scanning can assist without replacing that chain. Laser scanners and structured light systems record hull surfaces at millions of points. Computed tomography can reveal hidden fasteners and small components. Three-dimensional printing produces handling models, and numerical control can cut molds or replacement pieces. Digital records allow scholars far apart to compare joints. They also risk obsolescence, proprietary formats, lost context, and a false sense that surface geometry contains the whole craft. A scan does not record the sequence of force used to bend a plank, the wetness of the timber, or the argument that changed a decision. Future boat building will continue to combine old constraints with new tools. Autonomous craft still require buoyancy, stability, collision resistance, and maintainable systems even when no crew lives aboard. Floating wind platforms and ocean energy devices borrow methods from ships and offshore structures. Sea level change may increase demand for ferries, workboats, and coastal evacuation, while also threatening the forests and settlements that sustain local craft. Additive manufacturing can produce complex fittings and perhaps larger structural elements, but feedstock quality, inspection, repair, and energy remain decisive. Novelty does not suspend the water's tests. Across this long history, construction changed most profoundly when relationships changed together. A new fastener mattered because it joined a certain plank to a certain frame. A new engine mattered because fuel networks, ports, mechanics, and owners could support it. A new hull material mattered because yards learned to form, connect, inspect, and repair it. Communities selected among possibilities according to rivers, surf, ice, forests, cargoes, warfare, ritual, law, and wealth. Similar boats could emerge independently under similar constraints. Related techniques could also travel with people. Appearance alone cannot reliably distinguish convergence from transmission. Nor does the record describe a simple climb from primitive raft to perfect steel ship. A bark canoe can be more appropriate than a metal craft when it must be carried across land. A stitched surfboat can flex where a rigid seam suffers. A sewn ocean hull, a clinker longship, an iron steamship, and a carbon racing yacht solve different problems with different economies. Large scale is not the same as advanced understanding. The most revealing question is not which boat is best in the abstract, but what its builders expected it to do, with whose labor, under which risks. The first watercraft are lost beyond recovery, but the pattern of their making remains recognizable. Someone selected material, imagined a shape not yet present, cut or bundled or stretched it, tested the result, and revised the next one. Knowledge moved through hands and stories before it entered drawings, formulas, models, and databases. Those newer forms extended memory without making embodied judgment obsolete. Every successful launch still joins prediction to uncertainty. For a moment, the supports release, weight transfers, and the object meets water on terms its makers can influence but never command completely. That meeting is the thread connecting a hollowed pine trunk at Pesse. Planks sewn along the Adriatic, Egyptian river ships, Pacific voyaging canoes, Indian Ocean traders, Viking clinker hulls, Chinese junks, Atlantic sailing ships, riveted steamers, welded cargo vessels, fiberglass dinghies, and digitally modeled giants. Archaeological evidence gives some dates securely and leaves other passages open. Living practitioners fill parts of the picture while guarding knowledge that is theirs to share. Boat building history is therefore not a finished catalogue of inventions. It is an ongoing account of how human beings have negotiated material, water, movement, and one another.